Now we turn to discuss another way that governments may interfere with markets. Price controls. So price controls are attempts to set or manipulate prices through government regulations in the market. And they come in two varieties. Price ceilings, which are legally established maximum price for a good or service, and price floors, which are legally established minimum prices for goods or services. So just like the ceiling is the maximum point in a room and the floor is the minimum point in a room, price ceiling is a maximum price and a price floor is a minimum price. So let's start by looking at price ceilings and think about the significance of a price ceiling using a little thought experiment or example. So suppose the government imposes a price ceiling on bread of 50 cents per loaf. Why might they do this? You can probably think of several reasons, primarily because maybe we have a value in society that people should be able to afford bread, right? So we set a price ceiling and say the price of a loaf of bread can't go above 50 cents. We'd like for people to be able to afford bread. What, though, are some of the unintended consequences of this? Specifically, pause the video and think about the answers to these questions. Will there be more or less bread for sale? If bread only costs 50 cents per loaf, then we can expect to see empty shelves in the market. Consumers will want to purchase a whole bunch more, but producers will want to sell a whole bunch less, right? If you can't get much for the bread, you're not going to make a whole bunch of effort to get a lot on the shelves. We'll see empty shelves. We'll see a shortage. Will the size of a typical loaf change? So remember, the law just said that the price of a loaf can't be above 50 cents. So we can expect to see smaller loaves. What about the quality of bread? We can also expect to see lower quality bread. If producers can't get much money for a loaf of bread, they're probably not going to put a bunch of money into producing a high quality bread. Will the opportunity cost of finding bread change? Yes, we'll start to see lines around the block of people lined up because of this bread shortage to get bread. You'll have to maybe go from store to store to find somewhere that has bread in stock. The opportunity cost of finding bread will go up. And then lastly, because of those lines, would you buy illegal bread if you could? Sure. We'd start to see a black market for bread where those who were lucky enough to find it at 50 cents may be able to go back toward the end of the line there and sell it for 55 cents, right? Make a little extra money, sell it to people who are tired of standing in line and willing to pay a little more not to have to stand in line. So, though we set the price ceiling in order to maybe help people afford bread, we may have actually just hurt the very people we were trying to help by creating this bread shortage and these long lines for bread, and the black market in which those who can afford to pay even more will end up being the ones who can get the bread. So there are three different situations when it comes to price ceilings that we want to look at pretty quickly. So a non-binding price ceiling, a binding price ceiling, and then the long-run effects of a price ceiling. So let's start with the first one, a non-binding price ceiling. So think about this market. So here's the market for loaves of bread. We've got supply and demand, and we have our market price there of $1, and our market quantity is labeled. What would happen in this market if the government imposed a price ceiling of $2? So if the government says to this market, you're not allowed to have a price any higher than $2, what does the market say back? So what? Okay, didn't want to. The market wasn't trying to have a price that high. In fact, when we're given a price ceiling, anywhere beneath that price ceiling is the green zone. This is where it's okay to have a price anywhere below the ceiling, and the red zone is above the ceiling. You can't have a price higher than the ceiling. And in this case, the previous market equilibrium, the price that the market already had established for bread, was in the green zone. And so nothing happens. There's no effect on the market of a non-binding price ceiling. It's not binding. It doesn't make a difference. A binding price ceiling, on the other hand, would be a price ceiling that is below the market equilibrium. So if you think about when you walk into a room, do you even consider the ceiling? Does it make a difference in your life? No, not usually. I mean, it does. It keeps you sheltered, right? But typically, you don't even think about the ceiling when you walk into a room because it's high enough. You don't bump your head. What if the ceiling were 4 feet? Now it's binding. Now it makes a difference in how you enter the room because the ceiling is too low. So if the ceiling is too low, in other words, the market equilibrium, where the market wants to be, is in the red zone, that's when we have an issue. What issue do we have? When the price is set by policy, by law, beneath where the market would like for it to be, the market bumps its head, right? And at this price, at a price of 50 cents, notice the quantity demanded for bread is a lot higher than the quantity supplied of bread. We have a shortage in the market. Not only do we have a shortage, but remember, the supplier is the one who decides how much bread will be on the shelf, right? So the quantity supplied, the QS, tells us how much bread is on the shelf. When this is how much bread that's on the shelf, how much are people actually willing to pay for that bread? The demand curve tells us what consumers are willing to pay, right? So if this is the quantity of bread that is available, people are actually willing to pay way up here $2 for a loaf of bread because it's so hard to come by. And that becomes the black market price, what people are actually willing to pay for the amount of bread that's on the shelf. So we've actually ended up hurting where we wanted to help. Though the legal price of bread is lower, is at 50 cents, the actual market price, if you consider the black market, if you consider those people who go in and buy it for 50 cents and then go outside around the block and resell it, we've actually raised the price of bread all the way to $2 instead of $1. What happens in the long run? So if you remember from our discussion on elasticity, in the long run, our supply and demand curves flatten out. They get more elastic as we give people more time to adjust. So we get a picture more like this in the long run for bread. And with a 50-cent price ceiling, what happens? Things just get worse. The shortage expands. We get an even larger shortage in the long run. A little bit of good news, the black market price does come down as demanders become more elastic and are able to find substitutes maybe for bread. But still, we have that shortage problem gets even worse than it was before. And the black market doesn't go away. So where do we see price ceilings in the real world? One is in rent control, and the other is price gouging. So rent control, this is where particularly in big cities, you might have a policy that says housing prices, rental prices cannot go above a certain amount. So we'll see the same problems that we saw in our example of bread. We'll see shortages, and then we'll see some other unintended consequences like a reduction in quality of apartments, either because there's less maintenance or because there's decay, right? Because if you're the landlord and you're not able to charge a market price for rent, then you don't have as much incentive to keep up the apartments that you're providing. You don't have as much incentive to maintain the apartments that you're providing, and we end up with a lower maintained, lower quality apartments. We also may see a situation where landlords start nickel and diming tenants with fees to increase revenues. So you've probably seen this in terms of your college career if you've been around very long. So when we put a freeze on tuition and we don't raise tuition, what often does happen is you get more fees in order to help pay for those small things on campus that we now can't pay for out of tuition. So a landlord, you don't have to pay very much for rent, but if you want your light bulb changed, you're going to have to pay a fee to do that, right? We also will see decreases in long-term investment in the building of new units, because why would you enter into a market where you know you won't be able to charge market prices? You won't be able to get much money off of being a landlord. Why would you become a landlord? Why would you invest in building new units, new housing? And again, like in our bread example, this policy often ends up hurting the very people it was supposed to help. And here it is graphically. So you see that there's certainly a shortage. So this one graph shows the short-run supply and the long-run supply, short-run demand and long-run demand. So in the long run, things flatten out. People become more elastic when you give them more time, and the shortage just gets worse. So rent control is one example of a price ceiling in the real world. Another is price gouging laws. So price gouging laws are temporary price ceilings imposed during emergencies. So if you're a student in the area where I'm videoing these at the College of Coastal Georgia, you're very familiar with this. So when there's a severe hurricane, how would an uncontrolled market deal with an increase in demand for generators? If there's an increase in demand, you can draw this picture for yourself, shift your demand curve out to the right, and you'll see we ought to see in the market an increase in price. But price gouging laws say you can't do that. There's a temporary price ceiling imposed during an emergency. What are the consequences of the price gouging laws? Well, here's a picture of supply and demand for generators before the disaster. After the disaster, people need generators. We see an outward shift in demand and a new market equilibrium at a higher price and a higher quantity. But if the government imposes a price ceiling, a maximum price, on generators, notice it is higher than the previous equilibrium, so they're letting people raise the prices some, but not all the way up to that new market equilibrium. Because maybe there's the thought that it's unethical to try to sort of raise those prices and take advantage of people during an emergency. So the new market equilibrium after the demand shift is in the red zone in this case. What do we see happen? We'll see that the quantity demanded is higher than the quantity supplied, and we'll have a shortage. And it'll be hard to find generators. And we may even start to see, as we have seen before in this part of the world with hurricanes, we may even start to see black markets develop for these things that people need during a disaster. So that's price ceilings. Next we'll discuss price floors.